Have you ever wondered how far people might go for love? But what if that love isn't what it seems? What if everything you see is a carefully woven web of lies and manipulation, and the main character in this story is caught up in their own fantasies? A multimillionaire from Wales, a man who seemingly had it all, found himself trapped in his own illusions. What led him to turn his life into a nightmare, pulling down those around him in the process? In this story, there are no easy answers, and honestly, you'll be stunned to discover just how far emotions and passions pushed things to a tragic end. Pay close attention to every detail, because there's far less truth here than you might think. The Welsh tycoon and multimillionaire Peter Morgan, once at the height of his success and possessing wealth beyond imagination, suddenly found himself on the brink of disaster. His life, outwardly filled with prosperity and flawless harmony, hid behind its facade the shadows that often consume those facing a midlife crisis. A crisis that shatters the usual routine and pushes a person to grasp at the opportunities they missed in their youth, leading them down a dangerous path. This story begins on a quiet Welsh morning. In an old manor that served as a retreat for those seeking solace within its thick walls, two women sat on a sofa, sharing their secrets. In a bungalow tucked away in the dense woods, one of them confessed that her lover, who had once brought her joy, had become nothing but a source of frustration. She was on the brink of making a decision that would change everything. Meanwhile, miles away, a man sat in his home, clutching his cell phone. His fingers trembled, as if trying to hold on to the last fragments of his peace. Just a moment earlier, he had heard words that would alter his life forever. This story unfolded in Wales in 2016, centered around Peter Morgan, a man with a long history of success and affluence. Born in 1962 on a 300-acre farm near Newport, he grew up in a family that had no financial worries. From a young age, he understood that his future was already set. He would become a farmer, just like his parents. However, even then, Peter showed signs of entitlement and apathy toward education. He envisioned his life in the simplest terms, never imagining stepping outside the familiar boundaries. At 16, he dropped out of school to work in the family business, which, despite his lack of formal education, proved to be a stable source of income. Peter lived a predictable life for many years, working on the farm, marrying a childhood friend, and settling down in the small town of Usk with his two daughters. The comfort and stability of family life satisfied him for a while, but when he turned 30, Peter decided to change his fate. He left the farm and started building his own business, one that, while not particularly exciting, was highly successful. Starting with poultry barns, he developed a network of industrial chicken houses. The business thrived, and by the time he turned 40, Peter sold it for a 7-figure sum. This became a turning point for him. The midlife crisis crept in quietly, but its effects were immediate and devastating. It was as if Peter transformed overnight from a sensible businessman into a man obsessed with experiencing life in all its intensity and chaos. He began spending money as if there were no tomorrow, buying luxury cars like Ferraris and Lamborghinis, and outfitting his newly acquired mansion with extravagant items, including a tank and a helicopter. His fascination with weapons also became evident. An AK-47 rested on the desk in his office. But that was only the outward appearance. The changes in his life went far deeper than just financial extravagance. During a business trip to Amsterdam, Peter crossed a boundary for the first time at a private club, paying a performer for an intimate service. This marked his first act of infidelity, awakening an overwhelming desire to continue. From that moment on, Peter led a double life. On one side, family and stability. On the other, luxury and indulgence in forbidden pleasures. By 2011, his life took a new turn. At a private club, a friend told Peter about an app where one could book elite escorts. This conversation marked the beginning of his downfall. Once back home, Peter dove into the digital world where fantasies became reality. Soon, he spent all his free time browsing profiles and arranging meetings with escorts across the country, from Newport to Cardiff. Each encounter was new and unique, as Morgan made it a rule never to meet the same woman twice. It was his personal escape from his family life, which he cleverly disguised as business trips. His wife, Helen, suspected nothing. Peter had become skilled at covering his tracks, framing his escapades as work-related travel, while Helen, likely caught up in her own responsibilities, didn't notice how her husband was living a double life. Everything changed in 2012 when Peter celebrated his 50th birthday. It was then that he met Georgina Simons, a young and energetic 22-year-old woman. Georgina was born and raised in Newport in a family with 3 brothers. She had a strong personality, headstrong and confident. She dropped out of school at 16, got a job at a call center, and simultaneously enrolled in cosmetology courses. Georgina's relationship with Peter Deem, a man 6 years her senior, once seemed like a reliable path to a stable future. But her life began to shift when she gave birth to her daughter, Emily, at the age of 17. Becoming a mother, she tried to adjust to her new role, but soon she met someone who would completely change the course of her life: Peter Morgan. As a young mother, Georgina Simons tried to settle into her new life at Peter's mother's house, where they lived together with their young daughter. Her job at a call center brought in barely enough to get by, and every morning, waking up in the damp, unwelcoming house, she knew she wanted more. She was convinced that she deserved better, more money, more freedom, more excitement. Bored with the monotony of her days spent on the phone in a stifling office, she craved something more, something that would fill her life with meaning and luxury. Georgina often complained about how little they earned and how they were forced to cut corners on everything because of it. Her boyfriend, Pete, was a calm, home-oriented guy, uninterested in parties or a flashy lifestyle. Unlike Georgina, he was content with stability and routine, but his desire for a quiet, simple life increasingly frustrated her. Feeling trapped and unable to see another way out, Georgina decided to use her appearance to earn a living. The young woman became almost obsessed with her image. She began dressing provocatively, experimenting with makeup, and diving into the possibilities of cosmetic surgery. Soon, she underwent 2 breast augmentation surgeries, had liposuction, and took lessons in burlesque and exotic dancing. This opened the door to a world where money flowed freely. Working at a private dance club, she started earning sums she had only dreamed about before. She committed to a complete transformation, aiming to attract the attention of wealthy men who were willing to pay for her company. At this point, her life started to change. Georgina managed to move herself and Pete out of his mother's house and into their own apartment, and for a while, she felt like she had finally gained some independence. But it wasn't enough. Her ambitions and thirst for luxury grew stronger every day. Before long, her work at the club no longer satisfied her desires, and she began contemplating the next step, working as a high-end escort. She justified it to herself as a way to secure a better future for her daughter. She registered on a popular app under the alias Hannah James, offering various services for substantial amounts. Georgina knew her looks and skills would attract wealthy clients, and she was right. Pete, despite knowing about Georgina's plans, was against the idea. He understood the risks that came with those types of encounters and didn't want his partner to engage in such work. However, his love for Georgina and the fear of losing her led him to a compromise. The couple agreed to an open relationship, allowing Georgina to continue her escort work under the condition that it would remain hidden from their families. Her services and private life were kept behind the curtain, a secret accessible only to select clients. Georgina's profile on the app quickly gained attention. In May 2012, Peter Morgan, a multi-millionaire struggling with a midlife crisis, stumbled upon her picture. He was immediately captivated and arranged a meeting. During their first date, Peter and Georgina had dinner, chatting about casual things, and Peter felt a connection he had been missing. He was drawn not only to her looks, but also to her confidence. That evening, he paid her $200 for a kiss, but by morning, the amount had grown significantly. For Georgina, it was just work, but for Peter, it was something more. Up until this point, Peter had never met the same woman twice, preferring variety. But Georgina was different. He was willing to pay for her time over and over again, and their meetings increased from once a month to once a week. Peter realized he was falling for her. He loved being around her, and money was no longer an issue. He was paying not just for her services, but for her company. They went to movies and restaurants together, and Morgan showered her with gifts, clothes, shoes, expensive jewelry, and even a red Ferrari at one point. Over time, his feelings began to morph into an obsession. Peter wanted Georgina by his side as much as possible. He no longer saw her as just an escort. To him, she was a companion, something much more. His wife and children would go away for the weekend, unaware that another woman was spending time with him in their family home. For one such weekend, Peter paid Georgina $10,000 to stay with him. Peter's wife, Helen, had no idea that scenes playing out in her bedroom could shatter their marriage. For Georgina, it was all just business. She wasn't interested in Peter's growing obsession. For her, the focus was solely on the money he so generously spent. She continued to see other clients without a hint of remorse. Even her boyfriend, Pete, remained in her life despite her relationship with Morgan. But this didn't deter Peter. The only thing that bothered him was the idea of other clients also spending time with Georgina. The thought of sharing her was unbearable, so he decided to offer her something more: exclusive rights. Morgan was prepared to pay an enormous sum for Georgina to be with him exclusively, and she agreed. She knew she could earn more from one client than from dozens of others. From then on, Georgina met only with Peter, receiving around $133,000 per month. This amount covered her living expenses, food, and personal costs, and for a while, it seemed like everything was under control. But their arrangement was about to trigger events that would change their lives forever. The old estate, which felt detached from reality, became a kind of prison for Georgina and her daughter. Peter Morgan, intoxicated by his wealth and influence, believed he controlled every aspect of his new princess's life. He moved Georgina into a small bungalow on the estate's grounds, insisting it was for her and her child's safety, since the main house was too run down. As part of their agreement, her boyfriend, Pete Deem, was strictly forbidden from setting foot on the property, a condition Morgan imposed to isolate Georgina completely. This secluded life in a world of luxury went on for 3 years. Peter did everything in his power to create a fairy tale illusion for Georgina: expensive gifts, trips to London, and vacations in other cities, including a lavish holiday in South Africa. He paid for her cosmetic treatments and made a point of being with her as much as possible. In his mind, Georgina had become more than just an escort. She was like family. They rode ATVs across the estate, watched movies together, strolled down manicured paths, and shared intimate moments. Peter felt incredibly happy, completely absorbed in his fantasy. But beneath all this outward luxury, cracks were beginning to show. Despite living in a castle, Georgina still viewed Peter as just a client and continued to perform her duties without attachment. The more time she spent with Morgan, the less her boyfriend, Pete Deem, could see her. He struggled with her absence and the growing distance between their worlds. Trying to change the situation, Pete began focusing on self-improvement, working out, changing his appearance, and making efforts to become more attractive to Georgina. He lost weight, upgraded his wardrobe with designer clothes, and even whitened his teeth, hoping this would win back her attention. But the reality turned out to be much harsher than he had anticipated. Meanwhile, Helen, Peter's wife, started to sense that something was wrong. For a long time, she had ignored her husband's suspicious business trips, but everything changed when she discovered a receipt for flowers sent to another woman. She realized her husband had been unfaithful for some time, but instead of confronting him, she distanced herself even more, immersing herself in her daily routine. It seemed like she was content with this arrangement, or perhaps she simply didn't want to get involved. At the same time, Georgina began referring to her partners as Rich Pete and Poor Pete, clearly favoring the former. This nickname humiliated Pete Deem, making him feel like even more of a failure. Life in the castle, surrounded by luxury but disconnected from reality, continued. Georgina spent days and nights with Morgan, while her daughter grew up isolated from her father. During this period, her relationship with Pete Deem completely deteriorated, but Georgina remained indifferent, viewing Morgan solely as a source of income. For every encounter with Georgina, Peter paid additional fees, which amounted to thousands of dollars. This allowed Georgina to maintain her lavish lifestyle. To keep things interesting, she started bringing other women into the castle, and Peter found this added excitement appealing. He enjoyed these situations, often asking Georgina to find new women each time, though he still insisted she remain his main companion. One time, while his wife and kids were away on vacation, Peter invited Georgina and one of her escort friends to his family home. They spent the evening having fun in the marital bedroom, but Morgan wanted more. He asked one of the women to wear Helen's dress, acting out his fantasy of a trio involving himself, Georgina, and his wife. He knew in reality Helen would never agree to such a scenario, But that didn't stop him. In the moment when his fantasy finally came to life, Peter had no idea that Georgina was filming everything. She recorded every minute of the night, from her friend changing into Peter's wife's dress to all the events that unfolded in the bedroom. This footage would later play a significant role in the chain of events to come. The affair continued, but Morgan's life began to unravel. First, Georgina's boyfriend, Pete Deem, reached his breaking point. He could no longer tolerate that his partner was spending more time with Morgan than with him and their daughter. At a certain point, he decided to end their relationship, and this was the first crack in Georgina's life. Not long after, Peter's wife, Helen, discovered the truth. She accidentally found messages between her husband and Georgina, and realizing the extent of the infidelity, she decided to stop turning a blind eye. Peter tried to explain, admitting everything, but Helen wasn't willing to listen anymore. She filed for divorce, demanding a significant share of their assets. Georgina's life was hit with two tragedies in quick succession, events that she couldn't overcome. The first occurred in mid-2015 when her father took his own life. The event completely shattered her. Before she could recover from that loss, she faced another tragedy. Her ex-boyfriend, Pete Deem, also took his own life. After their breakup, he fell into a deep depression, unable to cope with living without Georgina and their daughter. In November 2015, he was found hanging in a wooded area. These events were the final straw. The once confident and strong Georgina fell into a deep depression. Alcohol and prohibited substances became her companions as her life started to fall apart. She couldn't handle the pain and loss, which pulled her into a darkness that seemed impossible to escape. Over time, the relationship between Peter and Georgina deteriorated. She began to distance herself, coldly ignoring his attempts to keep their connection alive. Deep down, Georgina blamed him for the death of her former partner, Pete. In her eyes, he was the one who had ruined her life, and she sought comfort in the company of another man, a longtime friend she had known for years. With him, she felt free from control and pressure, and their relationship started to grow. For Georgina, it was an opportunity to escape the hold Morgan had over her and to feel genuine support and care. However, the presence of this new man deeply unsettled Peter. Morgan, who had come to view Georgina as his possession, was not willing to accept her spending time with anyone else. He constantly reminded her of the money he had invested in her life, providing for her and her daughter, and in his eyes, that entitled him to control over her. Peter increasingly treated her as his property, and this became more obvious over time. The more he tried to control her, the more defiant she became. Georgina stopped tolerating his demands and accusations. At every event they attended together, she didn't hesitate to insult him publicly, belittling him and making him feel worthless. Her stubborn and fiery personality was now turning against him. Her behavior became increasingly destructive. Georgina sank deeper into a world of prohibited substances and alcohol, attempting to numb the pain of her losses and disappointments. Her use of mind-altering substances intensified, and rumors of her unhealthy lifestyle reached Child Protective Services. Authorities initiated an investigation, concerned about whether Georgina was fit to be a mother to her daughter, Emily. When Simons learned about the inquiry, her first reaction was to blame Peter. She was convinced that he had alerted the social services to increase his control over her life. There was no evidence to suggest that Morgan had any involvement, but Georgina refused to listen to any explanations. In her eyes, he was responsible for all her misfortunes, and she decided to confront him directly, sparking a major confrontation. This scandal became the climax of the growing tension between them. Peter, a man used to control, couldn't let her go. He began spying on Georgina, determined to monitor her every move. Leveraging his access to the estate, he installed listening devices in the bungalow where Georgina lived. Each of these devices contained a SIM card, allowing him to call and listen to what was happening in the room. Sitting at home, Peter would dial into the devices daily, eavesdropping on her conversations. This surveillance obsession escalated into a full-blown fixation. He would call the devices up to 10 times a day, spending hours listening to recordings to see if Georgina was being unfaithful or plotting against him. More than 2 months passed, and most of the conversations Peter eavesdropped on were uneventful. Chats with her daughter, small talk with friends. But on January 10th, 2016, everything changed. That day, Georgina had a close friend over, and the conversation took a different turn. When Peter dialed in to listen, he overheard Georgina venting about him. She expressed that her life with Peter had become a nightmare, but she felt trapped because of his financial support. She blamed him for involving child services in her life and admitted she felt like a prisoner in the estate. Fortunately for Georgina, the child services investigation had ended, and she was not at risk of losing custody of her daughter. However, she had no intention of sharing this outcome with Morgan. She realized she could use this situation to manipulate him further, leveraging his emotions to get more money. Georgina knew that the threat of losing her daughter was a powerful tool to control Peter, and she wasn't going to miss the opportunity to exploit it for everything she could get. But her plan went even further. Peter listened as Georgina openly told her friend that she intended to trick him into signing the bungalow over to her before cutting ties with him for good. Moreover, she had a trump card, the compromising video recording of the night they were together with her friend, who had dressed up in Peter's wife's dress. She planned to blackmail Morgan, threatening to show the footage to his ex-wife and daughters. Hearing her scheme, Peter realized everything was at stake. It became clear to him that Georgina intended to destroy his life, using his own vulnerabilities against him. At that moment, he felt his entire world collapsing beneath him. He knew that if his daughters found out about the recording, they would want nothing to do with him, and his friends and associates would turn their backs on him. Everything he had built could crumble in an instant. Listening to these revelations in the silence of his home, Peter Morgan felt a rush of emotions, from shock to rage. He couldn't believe that the woman he trusted was plotting such a betrayal. Her words diminished everything he had done for her, revealing their relationship to be an illusion where he was merely a puppet. On January 11th, barely making it through the night, Peter began to devise a plan for revenge, meticulously thinking through each step to regain control of his life. The very next day, his search history on his phone showed his intentions. He was looking up everything he might need to execute his plan. On January 12th, Peter Morgan went to a hardware store and purchased rope, zip ties, plastic bags, and rubber gloves. As soon as he returned to the estate, he headed straight for the bungalow where Georgina lived. This time, he didn't bother with pleasantries. He immediately confronted her, stating that he knew about her plans. He accused her of blackmail and made it clear that he wouldn't allow things to unfold that way. In a desperate attempt to keep her, Peter threw a pile of cash at her feet, promising everything, from marriage to a share of his wealth. He even offered to take out a life insurance policy naming her as the beneficiary, promising $1 million if anything happened to him. But instead of accepting his offer, she coldly rejected him. Her words, filled with hatred and contempt, ignited a blind rage in Peter. He tried to intimidate her, grabbing the rope and looping it around her neck, intending only to scare her. However, when Georgina threatened that he would pay for everything, his intentions shifted. All the anger, desperation, and disappointment inside him culminated in a brutal act. Peter tightened the rope, closing his eyes, and continued until she stopped breathing. When Georgina Simon's life slipped away, Peter didn't feel relief, only emptiness. He put on the rubber gloves, bound her wrists and ankles with zip ties, and wrapped her body in plastic. He then transported her to an old family property where his family once lived, hiding her in an outbuilding, thinking no one would find her there. But his haste and carelessness became his undoing. The security cameras he had personally installed captured every move, and Georgina's mobile phone, which he forgot to turn off, allowed authorities to track her location. When Georgina didn't show up to pick up her daughter from school, her friends and acquaintances immediately became concerned. By evening, her absence was apparent, and the police quickly launched a search. Morgan became the primary suspect. Trying to maintain his story, he claimed he had seen her around noon, but said she had asked him to leave. However, when the police traced her phone's location, they quickly realized he was lying. Under pressure from detectives, Peter tried to explain that he took Georgina's phone to protect her from harmful substances. However, his story was unconvincing, and he was taken to the station for further questioning. After several hours, he broke down and confessed to Georgina's death, claiming that he had been pushed to the edge. He attempted to justify his actions, saying that he had offered her everything, hoping to save their relationship, but was met only with threats and deceit in return. The trial of Peter Morgan became a highly publicized case. Despite his confession, he later tried to argue for a reduced sentence, citing mental health issues and emotional distress in an effort to downgrade the charge to manslaughter. However, the evidence, including his own confession and the surveillance footage, was overwhelming. In the end, Peter Morgan was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after a minimum of 25 years. And this is where I want to pause and speak directly to you all. This story is more than just a crime report or a detective narrative. It's a tragedy that reveals the truth about human vulnerability and obsession. Peter Morgan, a man who sought love and acceptance, confused attachment with ownership. He believed that money could buy a relationship, but in the end, he became a victim of his own delusion. Georgina, driven by her ambitions and the desire for a better future for her daughter, couldn't find a way to stop and was caught up in a game that ended in disaster. Perhaps the most tragic figure here is little Emily. Losing both her mother and father, she became a victim of adult games where there was no room for concern about her future. Remember, even in the most dramatic and difficult situations, there is always a way out if you acknowledge your mistakes in time and avoid building your happiness on lies and control.